And we're very excited for our keynote. I'm going to say a little bit about her. Dawn Morrison, and Dawn's going to correct me, I know, because I'm not going to say the name of your nation, right? Sequemp Nation in British Columbia. She is the founder, chair, and coordinator of the BC Food Systems Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty. And for over 20 years, Dawn has worked in horticulture, ethnobotany, adult education, and restoration of natural systems. She has dedicated her life to land-based healing and learning, and for the last 14 years has led community-based decolonizing food systems discourse, creating a critical pathway of consciousness that shines a light on the cross-cultural interface where Indigenous food sovereignty meets social justice, climate change, food systems research, action, and adaptive policy planning and governance. And last year, Dawn was going to be our keynote for our 2020 event that we had to cancel. So we are very, very happy that she said that she would come back and present our keynote today. And so we're really, really excited, Dawn, for you to be here. The title of Dawn's presentation is Indigenous Food Sovereignty, Indigenous Law in Practice. Please welcome Dawn Morrison.
Thank you, Cook's Jam, Charlotte, and everybody for having me here today. And I apologize for my lateness. I'm in my home community. I traveled here last night from Vancouver, and I have a whole team of staff and helpers that are coming to help with the work that we've got ahead of us this week. And so it's been a little bit hectic, and we got in so late last night we couldn't stay at the campground, so we're in a hotel, and the internet connection has been very weak. So I'm zooming in from my phone, and super happy to be here and to be invited to do this keynote presentation and share with you some of my work. I am zooming in from my home territory in Secwepemcúlecw, the land of the Secwepemc. As a member of the Secwepemc Nation, we are, I can tell you that our name translates to the people of the land where the water flows from the highest mountains through the rivers on its way to the ocean. So our name carries with it a very high cultural context of the important role that we play as Secwepemc, as the keepers of the headwaters of the waters that flow from the highest mountains. We have the headwaters of the Adams, which used to be, the Adams River used to once be a part of the Columbia River Basin until Coyote broke the ice dam back in about 11,000 years ago in the last ice age. And he reversed the flow of the Fraser River when the ice dam broke, and it brought the Fraser and the Thompson up to connect to the Adams River that was once part of the Columbia Basin. So as you know, the Columbia and the Fraser, well, I think the Columbia River system is larger than the Fraser, but the Fraser is the largest of 5 major river systems in so-called BC. And so yeah, that's who I am. We also have the headwaters of the Fraser River in our territory, more up to the north of Vavenby. And so we take our role as the caretakers of the rivers that flow downstream to the ocean, and the many, many Indigenous tribes along the river system that rely on wild salmon and the water that flows from our mountains. So that's in large part what has inspired me to do my work and to learn what I've learned and what I'm going to share with you. I come from a long legacy of political activism that's been held up in my Nisga'a Secwepemc community with people like the late Arthur Manuel, who taught me a lot in his years. I learned that he was also upholding a political legacy from his father, the late George Manuel, and his family still continues on with a lot of the work, the tiny house warriors, and many of the elders and women and people in my community who have taught me what I know. And so I really I want to honor that in my work and say that it's been very hugely inspired by that, but also as the founder and curator of the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty. I just want to clarify that I probably should have updated my bio a little better, but we are no longer affiliated with the BC Food Systems Network. We are, as a Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, we are an organization that stands as an autonomous voice and vision in food systems networks. And so I've been doing that work for the last 16 years. And yeah, thank you for the slides and for working that, Courtney. So yeah, as the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, we have 3 different main pieces of our work. And so the first one is decolonizing food systems, both research in action and policy proposals. We do different contracts, doing a contract right now with the Chilcotin National Government to lead a food sovereignty project in their nation. We also are working in partnership with the City of Vancouver, Vancouver Parks Board, to figure out how we can facilitate in an intermediary role to the Parks Board and the Coast Salish people whose lands that we are occupying in that space at Strathcona Park, where we were, our working group was awarded a residency by the Vancouver Parks Board. And so we do other decolonizing work with different agencies and governments who come to us to help, decolonize food systems and think about how would we reconceptualize frameworks for Indigenous food sovereignty, recognizing that the systems, the colonial systems, have been what's made us invisible and what has dispossessed us. So when we think about Indigenous food sovereignty and how that is actually Indigenous law in practice, we're at the kind of the crux of a lot of systems change that and rebuilding our own ways of governing and our own policies, our own practices. That is really an important part of the participatory nature of Indigenous food sovereignty. So we also have the Wild Salmon Caravan. That is a celebration of the spirit of wild salmon through the arts and the culture. And it's really trying to look at mobilizing Indigenous knowledge and networks around the important role that we play as Indigenous peoples in wild salmon conservation. And we engage communities in that work through the arts and the culture and kind of social transformation. We also have the Indigenous Food and Freedom School project, which we're in the 3rd year of developing. And so I go back and forth between my home community on the Sconeth Reserve, where we're developing a site there for the Indigenous Food and Freedom School, and expanding out to conceptualize what an Indigenous foodland conservation area looks like beyond just the privatized plots of agriculture land within a colonial narrative of agriculture, to say that our food lands are extensive. They're extended into the forest fields and waterways where we hunt, fish, and gather. So we've just been invited to a second stage of a large proposal to do that work, the research and kind of the conceptualization of that. So we also have one of the sites of our Indigenous Food and Freedom School at the Strathcona Park in East Vancouver. So that's our work. So I just want to preface by saying that, our work is really, when we reflect back on the last 16 years of organizing networking and learning events with to talk with Indigenous peoples, both within so-called BC, the 27, we haven't been to all of the 27 nations of Indigenous peoples whose land, who, are the original inhabitants of the BC. But we've also worked across Canada with different nations. And we've heard things loud and clear over the years. And one of them is that natural law is the law. And so when we think about Indigenous food sovereignty as Indigenous law in praxis, it's important to say that really, our Indigenous nation, actually, could you go to the next slide, please, Courtney? There, yeah. So our Indigenous nations, we work from our original instructions, which is guided by natural law. Of course, that's embedded in the language of the land. And so really realizing what is. So it's kind of not, it's coming from a place of recognizing and acknowledging that we haven't really lost our laws or our governance. It's just that we need to realize them more fully, that they're still there because the land is still there and because the knowledge is embedded in the land. And so this is really, really an important piece of thinking about law. And that nature, really, it's nature that gives us our ability to regenerate and heal and transform and make, and it's constant, and that we haven't lost that neither. That nature is still there guiding us. It's become a lot more challenging to attune to that because we've been interrupted, and there's all these interruptions from the colonial reality that we're trying to live in. So that also calls on systems change and innovation and trying to be in this present day reality, colonial reality, in a different way because it's different times. Our ancestors didn't have to do that. So yeah, reclaiming our voice and vision of our ourselves, scaling deep into what that means for us as individuals, as families, as communities, as tribes, but then thinking about what that looks like as we interface with the system itself, and reclaiming our voice and vision, becoming visible in the places that we've been made, that we've been disappeared, that we've been made invisible in our narrative of hunting, fishing, and gathering. There is no framework for agricultural research and development that positions us in it as hunters and gatherers. So it's really about saying to governments and forums that that's what we're here to do, is to reclaim that. So, and then of course, it's guided by Indigenous food sovereignty paradigms, principles, and praxis. So next slide. So there's 4 key principles that have reemerged consistently over the last 16 years that guide how we think of Indigenous food sovereignty and how it's expressed. And we avoid the limitation of a definition of Indigenous food sovereignty. We know there's a definition of food sovereignty that's used more in society at large, around, the right to control our own food. But we, in contrast to that, we don't reject that. We don't resist that definition. We know that that plays a role in kind of the forms where people are doing important work to resist the corporate control of the food system, and within an agricultural centric narrative. But Indigenous food sovereignty, we avoid the limitations of definitions because because there's so much diversity in Indigenous nations. But these are 4 key principles that have reemerged consistently in almost every conversation we've had around Indigenous food sovereignty. And that is the sacredness of food, and that it's a sacred gift. And those, the Creator gifted us with food. And it's amazing that we eat food, and our bodies, the bodies we were gifted with, are designed to transform that food into us. So it's the most transformative thing we do as individuals every day. And it's sacred and it's a gift. And in the colonial reality, we've kind of come a long ways away from even just realizing that. And I think as we wake up from this colonial reality, we become closer to how sacred that food is in communion with our food, the way our ancestors have for thousands of years. And we know that our spiritual protocols also have not been lost. Like those are still observed in our communities around food offerings and protocols at feasts and different laws around not wasting food and just really valuing the food for what it is. With that, the sacredness also teaches us our original instructions that Creator gave us to uphold the sacred responsibilities. So even more than a right, it's a responsibility to be in good relationship to our food and the land and the water and the people and the plants and the animals that provided us with their food. So we hold that as the ultimate kind of law or principle value. The second principle is the participatory action-oriented nature of food sovereignty. So as Indigenous peoples, we cannot achieve food sovereignty without participating in some sort of food-related action every day of our lives. Nobody's going to give us our sovereignty. We need to be able to hunt, fish, farm, gather, grow, cook, teach our children, be on the land. And there's a lot of beautiful knowledge that is participatory, and it comes with that being active. The third principle is self-determination. So being in control of our own, managing our own relationships to ourselves, to one another, and to be self-determined. And it's at all scales, from the individual up to even the international, with instruments like the UNDRIP and other kind of more soft law at the international level. But yeah, self-determination is key as well. The fourth principle is around decolonizing policy, planning, and governance. So while we know Indigenous food sovereignty is grounded in practice, and comes from our Creator, sovereignty doesn't come from a colonial reality or from a colonial government. It comes from our own, our Creator. In my language, we call the Tekelt Kukbi, the big chief. And so, but we do, it is necessary to interface with the colonial reality because of the impacts that it's having on our food sovereignty. So this is just a picture with myself and 2 of the manual twins in my home community, Kanahus and Mayuk. These pictures were taken shortly after the largest tailings pond breach from Imperial Metals mine, lead, copper, and zinc, up in one of the most important salmon rearing lakes, parts of the Fraser watershed, at Quesnel Lake and Hazelton Creek, where the mine spilled 24 million cubic liters of toxic sludge into that part of the watershed. And it's just a photo to speak to the colonial reality and only one of the kind of the impacts that we're seeing in the broader scope and scale of, the way we talk about Indigenous foodlands is the whole watershed even. And so these are serious impacts. We know that there is no environmental assessment act or policy that can adequately assess the health and cultural risks that are posed of different projects that are being that are taking place in our territories. So it speaks to kind of the broad scope and scale that we need to work at to really protect and conserve and regenerate our foodlands. So I've already gone through these slides, and before I go further, I just want to check, how am I doing for time?
You're good. We have until 10:15.
Oh, great.
So we want to maybe just have some time for questions, but I think we got.
Yes, for sure. Okay, sounds good. Okay, I've gone through this slide already as well, and this one, and we can skip this one as well. So this photo is just speaking to kind of the scale of, well, it's a photo taken from a parade that we organized for the Wild Salmon Caravan back in, I think this was 2017. The Wild Salmon Caravan is going into year 6 of our planning, and will be our theme this year will be honoring our grandmother's law, and we'll be organizing a procession and a cedar planting ceremony at Strathcona Park in East Vancouver, and a panel presentation at the downtown east side part of the city festival to talk about honoring our grandmother's law and what that means for us in food sovereignty, especially in the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is known as one of the most poverty-stricken kind of food insecure neighborhoods in all of Canada. So this is just a photo that speaks to some of the neighborhood networks that we've mobilized, and their showing of solidarity, and some of the artwork that gets created for the events that we organize. And it's been really amazing and powerful, and the response has been so big that we've had to look at, how we're going to respond to it all. As we are a grassroots organization, we're not a government body. We choose to remain grassroots. We're actually not even incorporated. We are considering that right now, but mostly we get our funding through forming administrative partnerships with different institutions or organizations who can take on the bureaucracy on our behalf, because we know that the proposal-driven funding system is very unsustainable, and it's a huge burden for us administratively. There's a really good book that I didn't get through the whole thing. It's pretty heavy, but it's called Accounting for Genocide, and how the system of bureaucracy and funding and administration has been really designed in a way that's actually a part of the genocidal reality. And so we try to get creative and just really remain grassroots and just about the networking. So yeah, this photo speaks to that. This photo speaks to an event that I was invited to back in 2000, and I think this was 2015. Oh yeah, 2015. I actually got smart and I included that on the photo, the date. This is a circle of healers and shamans from all over the world, mostly from the global south, but there was people from Africa, myself, and another elder from the Swampy Cree, Bob Sutherland, and his mother, Mary, Tom, and Lauren Dusto from down in around Oklahoma. I apologize, I forget the name of the nation that they're from, but they're amazing elders from there. As well as, so we were the only ones from Turtle Island, but there were amazing healers from all over the world, and we were invited to a World Spirituality Conference and a different event as well at the Takawasi Healing Center, where it was Indigenous leaders were talking about overcoming addictions through culture. And at this particular healing center, they were using ayahuasca to teach about the culture of it and to administer it to people who came for treatment, addictions treatment. So I was invited to go and share my story of how I overcoming my addictions actually led me to my work on Indigenous food sovereignty, and how that has been a framework for me to overcome not only my addictions, but a lot of the trauma that I inherited as the eldest survivor of intergenerational impacts of Indian residential school, and how my nation, the Secwepemc Nation, went from almost 100% alcoholism to 95% sobriety. There's a really amazing story, a video that you can find on YouTube called Honor of One, Honor of All, and it tells that story. So I was super honored to go and share that story at this event. And when I think of healing and trauma and addictions, and all of the social problems that we deal with, I just want to take a moment to also acknowledge that in my home territory right now, it's been a very heavy week for us because the remains of 215 children that were in unmarked graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School were uncovered just in the last week. And it's been a lot of grief for us in our communities. Many Indigenous peoples, I think, are feeling that, because we know that some of those unmarked graves were Indigenous peoples from other areas as well. And so when we think of healing and our culture, I think that we're in a powerful time right now of transformation, and that our work on Indigenous food sovereignty is really keystone to healing and regenerating ourselves, our ancestors, and our present and future generations, and how that all overlaps. But it's also connected to our land, and our healing can't be separate from the land. So there's really important teachings and protocols, and we hold that up, and really just make sure that that's in the intentions of all our ceremonies more and more. So this is a Decolonizing Food Systems Cross-Cultural Interface framework that we've developed. It's a framework we've developed based on Indigenous epistemology. I reference Gregory Kaheti a lot, who has, he talks about metaphor, and how as Indigenous peoples, we look at nature as a metaphor. It teaches us how to be in the world. It gives us our knowledge. It's our way of knowing, and it's really important, and often symbolized in art and ceremony. And research is ceremony, our ways of knowing. We set an intention and it comes, the knowledge comes. And so I also reference Manuel Andy Meyer, who talks about the holographic epistemology, and how a hologram is a metaphor for understanding different dimensions and realities. And so just as when we shine a light on a three-dimensional surface, it'll reflect light in different colors and different ways. so in food systems, in decolonizing food systems, where we can shine a light on the ways that the colonial reality and Indigenous reality interface, and come to an understanding of how those realities are expressed differently, and how they interface in both contentious and complementary ways. From there, we can then identify some wicked coyote questions or systemic problems that can help us transcend some contradictions. It may not be exhaustive and definitive and answer all the questions, but it gives us some structure and terminology and some to create cultural safe spaces in food systems discourse, because often as Indigenous peoples, we carry the burden to kind of, create those culturally or ethical spaces of engagement. And so it's really important to have that structure, and it's helped us over the years to help identify potential strategies that lives within gaps of knowledge where we've been made invisible in food systems discourse. So this is the graphic representation of the framework, and we've used the life cycle of the salmon as a metaphor for going through the process. That of course starts at the egg stage, or the conceptualization of the salmon in the east, where the direction where the sun comes up. And so as we enter into the journey of better understanding how the colonial reality, or it could be any reality, any other reality, interfaces with Indigenous food sovereignty, the reality of the way we express it, we enter into that journey and we start to identify key points of the way those different realities are expressed. So one key point, one example could be the model of economy. Indigenous economies are giving and sharing and trading economies, where the agri-food system, agricultural, is very much a capitalist economy. As we travel on from understanding the key points of entry into understanding the different realities and how they're expressed, this life cycle of the salmon will mature, and you can see going south from the east, the little Aleven stage of the salmon with a little yolk sac on it. That yolk sac is a, teaches us that as we mature, that we still need to have that yolk sac to nourish our minds and our bodies and our souls, so that we can grow and come to understand and grow into a teenager, a junior stage, where we come to understand a little bit more the world. There are different realities. And then as we mature even more into an adult, we can get into more complexity around how our realities interface. And so they interface sometimes in complementary ways. So one example might be the agroecology, the movement towards agroecology or regenerative agriculture is complementary in some ways, in the ways that it's attempting to minimize the ecological impact that agriculture is having on Indigenous land and food systems. But it's contentious in the way that it still doesn't position hunting, the broader ecological, cultural, and temporal scope and scale of hunting, fishing, and gathering societies that are the oldest living memory of what it means to have a sustainable food system on this planet. And so, we don't run from the points of contention. We want to name them and articulate them clearly, because that's where the transformation will happen. That is where we start to identify some wicked systemic problems, ask some coyote questions to help us transcend the contradictions. There's many paradoxes. We may not answer all the questions, unlike Western science that claims to be 100% objective and attempts to solve problems through a controlled experiment. We know things like climate change is not a controlled experiment. We know that natural law is about change, and it's about embracing that and embracing the contradictions and the paradox, and that the great mystery will guide us through our ceremony and through being in that unseen world and working in the spiritual realm. There's a lot of potential that lives in that. But that unseen world, there's a lot of gaps of knowledge, and that is where we can identify key points or key potential for whether it's research, and create even a matrix for generating a whole new body of knowledge and understanding. So then we go full circle, and we can then say that we've created some ethical spaces of engagement within the colonial reality. So that is that, yeah, I think this is a poster that was created by the Tiny House Warriors and some of the women in our nation who are resisting the Trans Mountain Pipeline in our territory. And in our language, we say, "Wuch milsekwa," water gives life. And this is a photo from the Wild Salmon Caravan. We were posing outside of the Nisconnet Band Hall in my community. And yeah, that's coming to the end of the journey. Those are some of the most committed elders and people that stuck with us through the whole caravan that year.
Dawn, it's always wonderful to listen to you and to share the knowledge that you have built within yourself throughout the years, and the sharing of that is always so powerful and inspiring. And it's really, it's always so nice to share these spaces with you, because every time I hear you speak, I learn more. So I think that's how, we all feel, that it's always such a joy to bring you to these spaces, because you create this understanding of the world and these connections to our homelands, connections to the waters, to the living things as our relatives, and really ground everything and frame everything that you discuss within those circles or those relationships of reciprocity. And it's always so beautiful to hear that. And I'm always inspired by it and inspired by your words. Tleko ushakshakleets. I really thank you. And we all thank you for sharing with us today.
I'm going through the comments to see if there are any questions, but feel free to either pose a question in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and ask the question directly. So please feel free we have time, so feel free to ask your questions now.
Hi, my name is Dove John, and I'm wondering, Don Morrison, did you say honor for one, honor for all is what we should be looking for, or what was that?
Yes, honor of one, honor of all.
Of one.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so very much.
Yes, it's a really old, it was a film, it was filmed back in the 70s, I think it was. So it's the quality of the film is, it's old, but it's really beautiful and powerful. And I can, I'm not, my internet connection isn't working very good here, but I can look for it after and send it to Courtney to share out as well, if that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a question in the comment that was sent to me. Was if you can go more into what ethical means.
Okay. Yeah, well, ethical, that's around values, around morals, the way I understand it. And when I think of ethics, I'll start with like a land ethic. So in the environmental movement, we know that there's this huge, I guess, this huge structure, colonial structure, in which a lot of the big environmental NGOs who are actually favored in a lot of the funding for environmental work, like Greenpeace and Wilderness Committee, and a lot of the bigger ones. And because they're not Indigenous, they often work from a different land ethic. So a land ethic that views nature as pristine wilderness, void of any human. So a lot of the national parks where is our territory for harvesting foods have been, managed in a way that we here in so-called Canada, we have to ask permission to go harvest in national parks because of that land ethic that underlies the way that the governments manage them and the ways that land is being, many environmental groups try to protect it in that worldview, that view that that the land is void of human, where we as Indigenous people, we know we are a part of that land, we harvest that land. It's by actually harvesting our plants, our picking our berries, our medicines, our hunting, our fishing, that we actually enhance the biodiversity. So that's a different land ethic. So that's kind of the biggest example that I use when I think about ethics. So it's the different ways that we value and we view the world and the morals that guide us in that. So one of the, like in terms of ethical spaces of engagement, I'm trying to create more ethical spaces for Indigenous peoples in food system discourse is about balancing the burden that we carry as Indigenous peoples to be educating the colonizers. Often we are the ones that, are very triggered by when they talk about conserving agricultural land. We have to sit there and listen to how they think of conserving it, but it's often privatized, and they don't acknowledge, sometimes they don't even acknowledge Indigenous territories. That's changing a lot, but they're still very much working within a very limited framework for conserving land. And it's very often, especially here in BC, in a provincial policy framework, it cannot be reconciled with Indigenous land title, which is Section 35(1) of the Canadian Constitution. It's two different scales and frameworks altogether. So it's often us carrying the burden to teach, and we are the most marginalized, and have access to the least amount of land when we think about how they're controlling it and governing it. But yet it's still our responsibility to educate. So creating ethical spaces of engagement means giving more structure and to taking some of that burden off of us. So the framework we've developed is really a tool to do that, but to work at an institutional level, because it's institutional change that needs to happen. Trying to educate all of society is a pretty big job, and I'm pretty much burnt out from that. It's not ethical. It's very challenging on us when we're dealing, especially with all the other social issues and genocide. What's happened in my territory with the 215 children. Then we know there's going to be more unmarked graves that surface. There's ancestral remains found all over Turtle Island. This is a genocidal system, and it's not ethical that the burden falls on us. So anyways, those are the two examples that I can think of off the top of my mind of how I contextualize ethics and ethical space.
Thank you so much. We have a few more questions, but I'm going to kind of maybe share. I'll start with the next one. Someone's asking, this is someone else asking, I'm trying to convince people of the dominant culture that they have nothing to fear from this knowledge. Do you have any hints or ideas on how to do this?
Yeah, well, I use the term that I know was developed. I think it was developed more in an international realm, biocultural heritage, because I think it evolved to kind of bring together the complexity of Indigenous knowledge beyond what many just say is traditional knowledge. But there's a lot of ambiguity in that knowledge, and it's all the English language. But I think when I'm talking to settlers society about our work and Indigenous knowledge and the keystone role that we play to protect, conserve, and regenerate the biocultural heritage of humanity, really. I think that the survival of all species is interdependent with the ancient, we're the oldest living memory of what it means to live in right relationship to the earth and to nature, and with the impending doom and gloom of all of the social and ecological crises we're living in, I think it's becoming more widely recognized that we do need deep systems change, and that Indigenous peoples are here to do that, and that it's a benefit to all. I think that all people of all colors care about the future of their children and their grandchildren. And I think there's a lot of people that aren't awake to that yet. But I think it's appreciating and building on the work that is happening. There are millions of people around the world, people of all color doing this work, and we just need more, I think, more institutional capacity, really. So I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of how I respond to people, to really think of the rainbow peoples, that rainbow coalitions, that a lot of the African Americans and people of color down in the US in the 1960s, as well as people like Nelson Mandela in South Africa when they brought the rainbow peoples together to end apartheid. It showed in both cases that the response to that concept and that term of rainbow peoples was, as I think, is really inspirational too. So I hope that helps.
Definitely. Thank you so much. That's and I think that kind of also, that's another question I think sort of expands upon being on different lands. Their question is, how do Indigenous people who are on different territory than their homeland connect to traditional foods that's respectful to the lands you are on? And so they share that, I do not want to necessarily introduce plants from South America to Turtle Island, but I feel I need to connect to traditional food.
Yeah, that's a huge question as well. And I often, I know that we have a lot of invasive species that have been introduced from all over the world. And so we're really struggling with that in my home territory right now. The crew that I've got waiting for me to go up to the garden site, we have a garden and we named it Kwechwelkuch, and in my language that means we are well. And we're starting a garden there, and we've got it in our plans to start an Indigenous plant nursery for habitat restoration. And but part of our team who've come here are actually from the global south. They're Maya people, and they're amazing. Daniel Mendoza and Ingrid Pegora, we've hired them as solidarity economy activators. They work out at the field house in Strathcona Park in East Vancouver. So our friends from the Global South have asked the same questions. But what we're doing here is we're embracing the biocultural heritage that they bring. We know that we live in a global reality. We, as Indigenous peoples, we've lived in a global reality for thousands of years. I think even before contact, there's evidence of prophecies and stories and research that showed that we've traded. We've traded tobacco and corn, beans, squash, and so we embrace that heritage of people that come from other parts of the world, and come in a way that is observing protocol, the spiritual protocol, asking permission of the land, acknowledging and setting intention and ceremony in our conversation with Creator that our times have changed, and now we need to share that knowledge, share the gifts of those foods. And it, to me, the answer to your question is really just about spiritual protocol, cultural protocol, sharing, doing it the right way, but asking the land too, and watching the land and seeing how it's changing with climate change. Some of the plants from the Global South can be grown be better here now because of climate change, but I guess doing it mindfully so that we're not creating, like bringing species that are invasive. I think invasive species, from what I've seen happen, are species that are also invasive in their own homelands. But we know that things like corn, beans, and squash, and other heritage varieties of tomatoes, they're not invasive here. So I think that that's the earth saying, yes, let's grow that here. It works with the Indigenous species here. So it's a beautiful conversation. It's a beautiful knowledge sharing opportunity, and I think it could even have more focus on like researching for climate change. What plants? I think plants and animals are naturally moving with climate change, and how can some of those important heritage varieties help us adapt our food?
I know there's a lot more interest, and I know we're short on time. So thank you, Leah, for your question. Thank you, everyone else, for your questions. There's also a lot of comments, so feel free to check those out. Don saying a lot of thank yous and appreciation for your presentation, and folks sharing from where they're coming from. I wanted to connect. I'm just kind of skimming through. So yeah, thank you so I'll just share a couple of comments. Thank you for the presentation, Don. This is from Michael Vendiola. Very inspiring work. Thank you for your articulation of the connection of food sovereignty and social activism. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you. We appreciate your time today. And I know that we'll definitely be sharing we'll also be sharing anything that I see a lot of folks are sharing links and so on the thread, and there's been some really great rich conversation as well, as folks are sharing additional resources. So we'll be collecting those and also be sharing that with folks who've attended today. Again, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. We're going to be let's give our speaker a round of applause, or thank you. I know it's virtual, so it's always so quiet now. It feels so quiet, but I know that would be a very loud round of applause in our in Wecklevault. But thank you again. We really appreciate you. So I'll pass it on to Charlotte, and we'll continue with the agenda. Thank you, everyone.